When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it left behind more than broken states and a ruined economy. It also left behind a mountain of debt. Over decades of Cold War politics, Moscow had extended billions of dollars in loans to allies, client states, and revolutionary movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These debts were not ordinary commercial loans. They were instruments of diplomacy tools to buy influence, secure allies, and expand Soviet reach. But when the USSR ceased to exist, Russia inherited not only the assets of the Soviet Empire, but also its liabilities, including unpaid loans scattered across the globe. For Russia, recovering these debts was nearly impossible. Many debtor countries were impoverished, politically unstable, or had little incentive to repay Moscow. And so, over the years, Russia began forgiving debts, sometimes as gestures of goodwill, other times as strategic moves to open doors for trade and cooperation. The amounts involved are staggering. Russia has written off well over $100 billion in debts, but some countries stand out because the sums forgiven were among the largest in history. One of the most striking examples is Cuba. During the Cold War, Cuba was Moscow's closest ally in the Western Hemisphere. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Soviet Union poured billions into the island's economy, supporting Fidel Castro's government with oil, machinery, food, and direct subsidies. By the time the USSR collapsed, Cuba owed Russia more than $35 billion, making it one of Moscow's biggest debtors. For years, the debt was a major obstacle in Russian-Cuban relations. But in 2014, Russia made a dramatic move. It agreed to write off about 90% of the debt, around $32 billion. Only about $3 billion remained, payable over 10 years. In exchange, Cuba offered new trade opportunities and pledged cooperation in energy and military projects. This was one of the largest debt forgiveness acts in modern history. Another major case was Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq had been a recipient of Soviet military and economic aid. By the late 1980s, Iraq owed Russia roughly $12 billion, but after the US-led invasion of 2003 and the fall of Saddam's regime, the new Iraqi government was desperate for international support. In 2008, Russia agreed to forgive most of Iraq's debt, about $12 billion, leaving only a small portion tied to future trade agreements. This move allowed Russian companies to regain a foothold in Iraq's oil industry and marked a strategic re-entry into the Middle East. Then there is Afghanistan. During the 1980s, when Soviet troops occupied the country, Moscow spent billions sustaining the Afghan economy. Loans and aid flowed continuously, but when Soviet forces withdrew in 1989, the country collapsed into civil war. By the 1990s, Afghanistan's debt to Russia had reached around $11 billion. In 2007, Moscow forgave the entire amount. For Russia, the gesture was as much about acknowledging the futility of collecting from a war-torn nation as it was about building goodwill with the new Afghan leadership. North Korea is another fascinating case. The Hermit Kingdom was long dependent on Soviet support, receiving food, fuel, and weapons during the Cold War. By the time the USSR collapsed, North Korea owed around $11 billion. In 2012, Russia struck a deal to write off 90% of this sum, about $10 billion. The remaining $1 billion was to be repaid over 20 years, with the funds earmarked for joint development projects inside North Korea. For Moscow, the move was designed not only to reduce a hopeless debt, but also to keep influence alive on the Korean peninsula, where China had become increasingly dominant. Mongolia also holds a special place in Russia's debt forgiveness history. For decades, Mongolia was heavily dependent on the Soviet Union, which financed infrastructure, industry, and social programs. By the 1990s, the Mongolian debt had risen to around $11 billion at an astronomical sum for a small country. In 2003, Russia forgave 98% of it, wiping away more than $10 billion. Only about $300 million was left, which Mongolia agreed to pay gradually. This act cleared the way for deeper economic cooperation and secured Russia's influence in a neighbor often caught between Moscow and Beijing. Vietnam, another close ally during the Cold War, also saw massive debt relief. The Soviet Union had supplied Hanoi with military and economic support during the Vietnam War, and afterward, when the country was isolated by Western sanctions. By the 1990s, Vietnam owed Russia roughly $10 billion. In 2000, Moscow forgave about 85% of this debt, leaving Vietnam with only $1.5 billion to repay. This decision helped reset relations between the two countries, opening the door for Russian energy firms to invest in Vietnamese oil and gas exploration. Ethiopia was another beneficiary. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union backed Ethiopia's Marxist regime with weapons, food, and development loans. The result was a massive debt pile that Ethiopia could never hope to repay. In 2001, Russia wrote off about $418 billion of Ethiopian debt, effectively wiping the slate clean. For Russia, the move re-established ties with a strategically located African country while allowing it to participate in infrastructure and energy projects. There were smaller but still significant cases across Africa. In 2012, Russia announced the cancellation of $20 billion worth of debt owed by African states, much of it dating back to Soviet-era aid and loans. This sweeping gesture was meant to revive Russia's influence on the continent, countering China's growing presence and creating goodwill among African leaders. Taken together, these acts of debt forgiveness reveal much about Russia's global strategy. They were rarely about charity alone. More often, they were about securing influence, creating economic opportunities, and mending ties left damaged after the Soviet collapse. By forgiving Cuba's billions, Moscow regained a symbolic ally in the Western Hemisphere. By wiping out Iraq's debts, it positioned itself as a player in the country's oil sector. By erasing billions owed by African states, it opened the door for partnerships in mining, energy, and military trade. But what stands out most is the sheer scale. Cuba's $32 billion, Iraq's $12 billion, Afghanistan's $11 billion, North Korea's $10 billion, Mongolia's $10 billion, Vietnam's $10 billion. These figures show how deeply the Soviet Union had invested in its allies and how dramatically Russia was forced to write those investments off. Few other countries in modern history have erased debts on such a massive scale. In the end, Russia's decisions to forgive debts reflect the paradox of its Soviet inheritance. The Soviet Union spent decades propping up allies with loans that were never meant to be repaid. Russia, inheriting those obligations, found itself burdened with worthless paper. Forgiving debts became not only an act of necessity, but also a tool of modern diplomacy. It reshaped relationships across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and it left behind one of the most extraordinary records of debt forgiveness in global history.